But let's stick with this strategic posture, the defence of Australia to our north, and cross back down to Canberra now and catch up with Peter Jennings, who's the Executive Director of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, who's co-authored this report with the United States Study Centre. Thanks for joining us, Peter. In a nutshell, are you saying that the Australian government and our analysts have taken their eye off the ball a bit when it comes to making sure we've got the appropriate resources and sophisticated arrangements for our defence across our vast northern coastline?
Well, we can never afford to take our eye off that particular ball, Chris. And one of the things that we say in this report is that it's really been 30 years since the last time the government had a serious look at the distribution of our forces in the north of the country. That was at the time of Paul Dibb's review in 1986 and then Kim Beazley's 1987 white paper. A lot of water's gone under the bridge since then, including, we think very differently these days about Indonesia, more likely to be a partner than an enemy, I think, in future strategic contingencies in this part of the world. But in some ways that makes the idea of actually looking at the distribution of our forces in the north even more important. And so our report comes up with some practical suggestions about what might be done. And it also tries to link that to a broader consideration of what's going on in the region and, you know, where we should be concerned. What are the key practical recommendations? Well, we think that it's important to look at the north not only as a base from which troops in the Australian Defence Force might operate, but also to look at industry support, maintenance of defence equipment, and also to look at the opportunities that are presented for Australia to cooperate with the United States, the large presence of US Marines, which are now operating out of Darwin for half the year, and opportunities to do more things constructively with the Indonesian military. You know, these are issues that really weren't in play 30-odd years ago, but now become a feature of what we can do. So we present the idea of the North as a forward operating base, a system which has to include the private sector in terms of industrial support, and an opportunity for cooperating with countries in the region. Is this, in effect, already happening, at least to a degree, with, as you say, the rotation of US Marines through Darwin, and that's an annual arrangement. It's in its early days. And also the announcement just weeks ago that the US is going to spend upwards of $300 million improving its facilities around Darwin. I think there's a case to say that Australia should be doing more in its own right. I mean, it's great that the United States sees the strategic value of maintaining a military presence in the north of this country. But somewhat unexpectedly, perhaps, our own defence establishment has never tended to be that enthusiastic about locating military forces in the north. As we show in our report, the overall numbers of Australian military has been reducing over the last decade. That used to be connected to an argument that it was something of a hardship posting, that it was difficult to find military people that were prepared to be posted up to the north. But, you know, frankly, I think that overstates the difficulties of being based in the north. There are many people in the military who actually enjoy their postings up there. And regardless of whether it's difficult or not, it does actually reflect our own strategic front line in a region which is changing very dramatically, Chris. So we can't be blind to that. And therefore a strong expression of Australia's military intent to look after the defence of our own country really needs to begin with a strong presence in the northern, the top half of the country. Peter, I'm interested in just how our nation's strategic outlook seems to change, at least in terms of the rhetoric and the superficial focus rapidly. I'm thinking in the early years of the Rudd government, I think it was a defence white paper came out and talked a lot about major threats in the regions. It didn't name China, but everybody assumed it was about the threat of Chinese expansionism. Then under Julia Gillard, of course, just a few years later, she talked about how the situation was that it was non-state actors
would be the greatest threat to Australia. And then soon enough after that, we're back to the 9/11 decade is behind us. And yet here we are back, certainly with your report, focusing on presumably, again, the expansionism of China, other threats in the region as well. But obviously it's the expansionism of China that has most defence strategy thinkers worried.
Yes, Chris, so it seems almost that every change of Prime Minister creates a need for product differentiation when it comes to saying what Australia's defence strategy should be. It's certainly true to say that our strategic outlook has been changing very dramatically. And although governments are a bit reluctant to actually say the name, it's obvious that China is now, the number one risk as we think of the stability of the region in coming years. That doesn't necessarily translate into a direct threat to Australian territory, but it certainly presents very real challenges to the stability of the Asia-Pacific that we can't be indifferent to. I think that it actually slightly recasts how we should be thinking about the North. We're long gone from the days when we would be thinking about how do we protect ourselves from small, what used to be known in defence circles as low-level incursions of sort of Indonesians that might be engaging in sort of hit-and-run attacks in the north of the country. Nowadays, we're much more likely to think of Indonesia as a defence partner, which is a great position to be in, given their geography relative to ours. And I think we can see the North as a place from which we can operate in collaboration with the Americans, with the Indonesians, the Singaporeans and others, all in the interest of promoting a more stable Southeast Asia and the approaches to the Australian continent. So the thinking has changed, and really what that means is that we need to rethink how we might make use of the North to promote our direct security and make a contribution to the stability of the region at the same time.
Now, what about at the current state of our equipment and our procurement programs? We've always wanted to keep aerial supremacy in the region. Does the Joint Strike Fighter and delays in that, does that create a weakness for us for a period?
You know, Chris, I don't think so. I have to confess to being a fan of the Joint Strike Fighter, although that seems to be a bit unfashionable at the moment. It is the most capable so-called fifth-generation fighter in service around the world today. We only have two currently in country, but there are more coming next year. And over the next few years, they will replace the Hornet F-18 aircraft, which has been the mainstay of the Air Force for the better part of a generation. When that moment happens, we will actually have one of the most modern air forces in the world. Small, it has to be said, but highly capable. And we've demonstrated the quality of the Air Force through successive military operations in the Middle East on those campaigns in Iraq and fighting IS in Syria. So I'm not in that very large group of detractors who wants to say that the equipment is all bad and that the wrong choices have been made. I don't think that's true. I think we can be very satisfied with the quality of the Joint Strike Fighter and all of the other air platforms that are being acquired. I would probably like to see a few more of them, Chris. I think that's the big vulnerability, is that for a country this size, operating a fighter fleet of 72 aircraft kind of shows you that we're at the bare minimum of what I think is a credible defence capability overall.
Yeah, and what about submarines? Similar issue, untried technology, a big delay in getting them into service. Are we vulnerable? Yeah. Is there a gap in our maritime defences looming?
Well, the Collins-class submarine continues on, and again, that does have a pretty awful reputation over years of reporting. So let me confound the critics once again, Chris, by saying to you that the Collins-class submarine is probably the best conventional submarine operating in the world today. It will have to have its own life of type, as it's described, extended for a decade or so from now in order to fill the gap between the end of the Collins program and the arrival of the new submarines with a French design. So again, I think the real problem we have is one of numbers. There are 6 Collins submarines. That means to say, given the cycle of maintenance and scheduled upgrades, there are probably 3 to 4 available for operations at any one time. That's not many for a country the size of Australia.
It's our problem, isn't it? We're a huge continent and only 25 million people, and so it's hard to have the resources to adequately defend all of it. Just finally, Peter, when you talk about these issues and where our focus needs to be in defence planning, well, of course, the next deployment of Australian military seems likely to be yet again to the Middle East, given that the US has requested Australian involvement. Is that typical of what we've seen? We've been distracted by those sorts of operations, which, as you say, have demonstrated our capabilities and refined, I suppose, some of our practices. But we need to get back to really focusing on our own region.
I think that's true. I think a lot of the really major strategic risks that are emerging in the world today are emerging in the Asia-Pacific, Chris. There's no question. China is mostly behind all of them. If our government does end up sending a ship to protect maritime shipping through the Straits of Hormuz in the Gulf, that's a task that our Navy is amply able to perform. But the main game is back here in the Asia-Pacific region. And I think that's where we'll be concentrating our defence spending effort in coming years.
Thanks for joining us, Peter.
Thank you, Chris.
Peter Jennings there, who's the Executive Director of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, and that major report today, getting us to focus on our defence planning and spending on Northern Australia for all the reasons Peter outlined there.